We're going to move to our next session, which is going to look at pandemic response and the measures that governments put in place and what we would like to see happen differently. And to take us through that, we have James Wiltshire, who is our Assistant Director of External Affairs. He's had a decade at IATA and before that a decade at the CAA, and he's going to take us through a sort of imagining of how things could be better next time. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Chris, and good day to everybody. So, of that decade spent at IATA, I spent about 3 years of that dealing with COVID-19, as part of the IATA's industry response to COVID, heavily involved in the work at ICAO, and also a lot of bilateral engagements with states. And I really want to draw on that insight and experience today in explaining the importance of preparing for future pandemics. And to do that, we're going to set up a fictional scenario for you in the context of a future pandemic, which we call COVID 2030. I want to start by stressing that this is not a prediction at all. We've got no idea when the next health emergency will be, and we hope that it won't be for many years or decades. But we do anticipate that there will be future health emergencies and pandemics, which is why we need to do the work now to prepare for them and not simply move on from COVID, which we all desperately want to do, but that's not the right thing. I think that's the central and critical message of this presentation, is that it's the actions that governments, the industry, and ICAO take now to learn the lessons from this health emergency that will determine our ability collectively to respond to the next one. And that's what I want to talk you through. So let's jump forward a few years. The year's 2030. International air connectivity is fully restored. Demand of passengers has climbed above 2019 levels around the world. And at economic level, after a couple of tricky years with the situation in Ukraine, the battle with inflation, the global economy is growing as well. So, big picture, it's all good. Passenger demand is booming, the economy is strong, airline financial performance is strong. And all of a sudden, this calm is disrupted as reports start to emerge of a new and mysterious virus that's been detected and is starting to circulate. The parallels with COVID-19 are frightening, and the initial response is anxiety. But unlike 2020, governments don't rush to close borders, and airline industry isn't brought to a standstill because governments have spent the time after the pandemics have subsided in 2023 and subsequently to learn the lessons of COVID-19 and to get their houses in order. And I want to talk about 4 key elements that make that possible. That make 2030 COVID different to 2019 COVID. Firstly, governments move quickly to implement proportionate, risk-based, and time-limited health measures. Second, where governments require passengers to present information on their health status before travel, this is done using dedicated web portals. And where health certificates are required, the 4 main health certificate standards that emerged during COVID-19 are all mutually recognized. Third, governments did an effective job in communicating directly with both consumers and industry. So everybody understands the measures in place and the rationale for them. And fourth, and underpinning all of this, governments understand the economic and social cost that COVID-19 border measures had, and for a very limited and temporary health impact. And so the instinct isn't just to simply pull up the drawbridge. So I'm going to go through each of these 4 elements in turn and describe some of the actions that are needed to make them possible. Firstly, the proportionate, risk-based and time-limited health measures. The ICAO's Council's Aviation Recovery Task Force was quite quick off the mark, actually, in 2020 in seizing the scale of the problem and putting in place a multi-layered framework of risk-based mitigation measures. That was critical to the very initial phase of industry restart in that early phase in mid-2020. At that time, of course, we didn't know half of what we know now about the virus, and we didn't know what would be effective in mitigating its spread. Therefore, it made complete sense that ICAO's framework put together a multiple layers of options, even if we didn't know if they'd all be effective. Having many potential layers gave the best chance of success. That's what's called the Swiss cheese model. It's what's on the right-hand side of this chart. The idea that if you have many slices of Swiss cheese, it's less likely that the holes will all line up and at least some of the defenses will be effective. We're now almost 3 years on from that. We know an awful lot more about how the virus circulates. We know an awful lot more about what is and isn't effective in slowing its spread. In particular, we know that some of those multi-layered measures are pretty much ineffective. For example, temperature screening was widespread during the early phase of the pandemic, but was almost useless in detecting COVID. Similarly, airlines were forced to undergo additional cleaning and disinfection protocols, which we now know had almost no incremental benefit over standard cleaning practices, despite the fact that they added considerable time to turnarounds and caused airlines significant costs. It's those kind of lessons which we need to learn now so that we're better prepared for the future. And that was one of IATA's key asks of ICAO at the 41st Assembly earlier this year, to do this science-based review. After strong endorsement of that request from the Assembly, we'll now be working with ICAO to deliver that review. The next stage will be to turn that into a ready-to-go playbook that can be quickly deployed in future health situations. Use that science to prepare for the future. And it's important that that is pathogen neutral. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is we don't know what the next pathogen or virus will be, and we can't be caught out like we were with COVID when it's something we hadn't prepared for. Therefore, it needs to be a framework that can be easily adapted to the specifics of the threat that we're facing. Third, governments need to be much more transparent about the risk assessments that they're making, the decision criteria and the trigger points. That's critical for consumers so that they understand the trajectory of the travel measures they're facing, and they can plan travel and book with competence and certainty. And similarly, it's important for airlines so that they can put together schedules that they can be competent, can be operated. Finally, on this slide, I want to make a specific point about aircrew. You may be aware of the statistic that Cathay Pacific estimated that its aircrew spent over 73,000 nights in managed quarantine in Hong Kong in 2021 alone. That's more than 200 years. Lots of foreign carriers suspended service to Hong Kong during this period, not because of lack of custom, because there was strong demand for air cargo in particular, but because of the complexity of the crew regulations. We know that aviation has a really important role to play in responding to pandemics by enabling the shipment of medicines, of vaccines, and of PPE. It's also important to keeping the global economy and supply chains moving. That needs aircrew, and it's really important for the future pandemics that there is better treatment and better recognition of the importance of aircrew. Moving on to the topic of health credentials. Digital health credentials were clearly a COVID success story, and we now need to build on that platform for the future. Firstly, the capabilities that were developed during the COVID-19 pandemic need to be maintained and enhanced. In particular, we are concerned at the possibility that the legal basis underpinning the EU digital COVID certificate could be allowed to lapse in the middle of next year. Now, we all agree that there's no need for the DCC in the current circumstances, but the system should be mothballed, not dismantled. That would be a very much a backward step. Second, I've already talked about this. During COVID, 4 main digital health certificate standards emerged, but they don't have a platform for mutual recognition. That should be put in place now. Equally, the WHO should continue its work on a digital international certificate for vaccination and prophylaxis, the so-called yellow card. This is really important for having a universally recognized global document. Finally, where governments require travellers to provide information about their health status in advance, this should be done through health dedicated web portals. There are lots of positive examples of this around the world that were developed during COVID-19. I mentioned Australia and in Canada, just to name two, and other governments should learn for these. This is important because that means that passengers transmit their data directly to the governments rather than airlines having to handle sensitive health information about their passengers, which they don't want to do. We don't want the data privacy concerns that go with that, and we don't want airlines to have to be de facto health inspectors like they had to be during COVID-19. Third point, and this is really critical, is communication. During COVID-19, it was very confusing for consumers, and it was very confusing for industry to navigate the different measures in place. It's imperative that governments do a much better job of communicating directly with the general public and with the industry, rather than using airlines as the intermediaries, because all too often during COVID-19, airlines were as confused as the traveling public were. It's also important so that everybody has the same understanding, not just of the measures, but of the rationale underpinning them. And that comes back to the risk assessment point and the transparency point I was making earlier. Of course, all of this will be easier if there's much more coordination and consistency between and across states in terms of the measures applied. And also, if there is more effective collaboration and engagement between aviation and health sectors before and during a health emergency. That was something that we've really learned, that the relationships need to be built between those two sectors so that we're speaking one common language. And there is a role for both ICAO and WHO as global data repositories for these measures. Final point, the final pillar, is around the understanding of the economic and social costs of border measures. Our partner organization, ATAG, estimated that during 2020, border measures put $1.7 trillion of economic activity and 44.6 million jobs at risk. That was in 2020 alone. But what's becoming clear, as is the case with health, with mental health, with education, so it is with the economic impacts, that some of these impacts will take a very long time to become apparent, and we won't see them until well into the future. Conrad talked about the survey of European businesses. We also asked them about the impact of COVID travel measures on their ability to do business, and 85% of them said that border measures had had a negative impact on that ability. I've talked about the importance of keeping aviation moving to the pandemic response as well, and that's clearly critical. Against all of these severe negative impacts of travel restrictions, COVID-19 really confirmed what was our received wisdom before the pandemic, that at best, border measures have a limited and temporary impact in terms of the circulation of the virus itself. And we did modeling, some of which you see represented on the right-hand side of this chart, once the Omicron variant emerged about a year ago from now, on the impact of having additional testing and quarantine measures in place versus not having them. And what they detected was that there was at most a 1 to 2 day delay in the peak of infections and no discernible difference in the scale of the peak of infections. So really, not buying you much time and not lessening the impact of the spread of the virus. So to summarize, because governments learned the lessons of COVID-19 and put these 4 elements in place, they were able to navigate COVID 2030 much better than they did COVID-19, and without closing borders and bringing aviation to a standstill. But I want to emphasize that key point. It was only because of the actions that government, industry, ICAO take now and in the coming years to learn the lessons of the pandemic that they were able to respond better to the future health emergencies. So with that, I'm going to conclude my remarks and hand over to you for questions, Chris.
Thanks very much, James. Have a seat. And yes, we've time for a couple of quick questions if anyone wants to kick off. Do we, none of us care about the pandemic anymore? Goodness me. Maybe I'll, oh yes, so go ahead, Helen.
Thanks. Just when you talked about the system for the digital certificates, that needs to be mothballed rather than done away with, what needs to happen for that to take place?
Specifically for the EU digital COVID certificate, the legal basis for that has an expiry date, which is in June next year. And we understand that there are voices, particularly within the Parliament, who are keen to let that lapse. And what we want is for that legal basis to be extended. I mean, let's be clear, we don't think that the DCC needs to be in practical everyday use, but we want that legal basis to be extended beyond June 2023.